When American history or political science is studied, a common question is, what would the Founding Fathers have thought about America and the world today? Entire books have been written on the subject, and it is the topic of a lot of speculation. But to truly answer the question, a good place to start is to look at what the founders believed about the future. Of course, the Founding Fathers weren't unified on their beliefs, as is any generation. For starters, many of them were deists, believing in a God who isn't actively involved in the affairs of the world. And some likely didn't have any clearly defined beliefs. But among those who were practicing Christians, most believed in a model of history in the future known as post-millennialism. When theologians think of postmillennialism today, they usually reference the notion that the world will get better and better until Christ returns, sort of a thin religious veneer for a humanistic view of the future. But the postmillennialism of the Founding Fathers generation was quite different. The colonial preacher Jonathan Edwards did much to popularize a postmillennial viewpoint among the American colonists, as well as their contemporaries back in Europe. While adhering to the essentials of Christian beliefs about the last things as taught by the early church fathers, such as Christ's ultimate return in glory, the final judgment of all people, and an eternal new heavens and new earth, Edwards and others in his era recognized a pattern that the early church fathers would not have understood, that there are different eras within the Christian era. Often, the writers of early Christianity spoke of persecutions and martyrdom as the norm within Christian history. Of course, that's the only condition they ever knew. But centuries later, Christians were recognizing that this period of hardship in early church history was not indicative of the church age as a whole, but was rather a time of testing at the beginning of what would otherwise be a victorious era. Preachers at the time of America's founding turned to Revelation 20 for what they believed was an overview of history in the church age and beyond. They interpreted the 1,000 years of peace not as a future kingdom after Christ's return, but as the state of the world during the church age at its prime. The world would improve generation by generation as the gospel would go forth unto all the nations. Recognizing that the spread of the gospel has a side effect, improved social conditions, most expected the world to become a better place in more ways than one. At the end of this period of improvement would come a sharp reversal toward apostasy and rebellion. This last period of hardship wouldn't involve persecutions as much as the early church period did, but would manifest more in a widespread rejection of Christian principles around the world. 2 Thessalonians 2 and Jesus' comparisons to the times of Noah and Lot were referenced as evidence of this last period. Finally, Christ would return and set up an eternal kingdom. So if the Founding Fathers could witness the world in the 21st century, where would they believe we are in their understanding of the future? This brief outline of the beliefs of the Founding Fathers era might give us a clue. This is taken from a rare book written by a professor at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary in Massachusetts. It tries to summarize the end times beliefs and philosophy of history of America's founding generation. Based on this outline, we can assume that America's founders would recognize that the spread of Christianity around the world in the past 200 years was a manifestation of the first 2 points they expected: the rise of the global middle class, medical advances, and an end to barbaric practices such as the slave trade during the 19th and 20th centuries would strengthen their viewpoint. In the 20th and 21st centuries, more Jews have converted to Christianity than at any other time in history except for the early church. Quite likely the Founding Fathers would see this as the conversion of ethnic Israel that they anticipated in the future. And as a side note perhaps, this belief about Israel probably played a role in the generally positive relationships between the US and the Jewish people throughout American history from the start. But no doubt, the current global conditions would indicate the fourth point, the period of apostasy believed to occur right before and simultaneous with the end of human history. If the outline of history in the future I just mentioned seems familiar but a bit different than what you've heard in most Christian denominations, you're correct. At the time of America's founding, the end times beliefs of the early church had largely been forgotten. The main theological difference is that the early church fathers believed that the millennium would be a 1,000-year period after Christ's return, not before. Theologically, I'm inclined to adhere to the beliefs of the early church. After all, many early church writers were contemporaries of, or only a few generations removed from, the apostles themselves. Some could even ask the apostles John, Paul, or Peter to elaborate on the teachings in the epistles. But we should also recognize that America's founding generation, known globally as the Republican generation, were generally men and women of great wisdom and study. Plus, they could see history in a different light, living 1,500 or more years after the early church. It's certainly worthwhile to understand the end times beliefs and view of history that America's founders held, both as theological food for thought and to shed light on American history as well.